The scent of pine and old stone was a lie, a thin veneer over the rot of conquest. It clung to the air in the great hall of Silverwood, a place built to inspire awe, but which now felt like a gilded tomb. Cold seeped through the thin wool of Miriam's tunic, a drab, shapeless thing meant to signify her status as spoils of war. She knelt on the marble floor, her bare feet numb, her head bowed as she had been commanded. The weight of 100 hostile gazes pressed down on her, heavier than any physical chains. They whispered like dry leaves skittering across pavement, their words sharp and cruel, meant to be overheard. Look at her, barely a wolf to speak of. A Sulthar Omega, they say the line is barren. The king will tire of her before the next moon. She's a broken little thing. Miriam focused on a single imperfection in the polished stone before her, a hairline fracture that spiderwebbed out from beneath the leg of a courtier's chair. It was a tiny flaw in this world of suffocating perfection, a reflection of her own shattered pack. She held her grief coiled tight in her belly, a cold, hard knot that had been her only constant companion since her alpha fell and her lands were ceded. They wanted to see her weep. They wanted to see her tremble. They wanted proof that she was as worthless as her conquered status suggested. She would give them nothing. Her silence was the only weapon she had left, and she wielded it like a shield. The great hall was a cage of opulence. Sunlight, heavy and golden, streamed through arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like captured sprites. It caught the glint of jewels on elegant necks and the polished silver of guards' pauldrons, but it offered no warmth. At the far end of the hall, raised on a dais of dark carved wood, sat the throne. It was immense, fashioned from the heartwood of a petrified ironwood tree, its back carved into a snarling wolf's head. And it was empty. The waiting was a special kind of torture, designed to let the court's contempt fester and bloom. A high-ranking beta, the king's chamberlain, stood beside the dais, his face a mask of bored disdain. His name was Verith, and his scent was of dried ink and smug authority. It was he who had dragged her from the cold cell and thrown her onto the floor, his voice dripping with condescension as he announced her. A tribute from the fallen Sulthar pack, he had proclaimed, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. For the Alpha Kings, consideration. The word hung in the air, ripe with insinuation. A dark-haired she-wolf near the front, her gown the color of blood wine, let out a delicate, mocking laugh. Miriam recognized her from the whispers as Lady Ascara, a high-born alpha female who had been circling the empty Luna's seat for years. Her eyes, the color of chips of ice, raked over Miriam with predatory assessment, dismissing her utterly. Consideration? Lady Ascara murmured to her companion, her voice carrying easily. He'll consider her for a single night, perhaps, if he can bear the scent of dirt and defeat. Miriam's hands, hidden in the folds of her tunic, clenched into fists, the urge to lash out, to show the feral spark that all wolves possessed, was a bitter taste in her throat. But she was an Omega. More than that, she was a conquered Omega. Here, in this court of vipers, any show of spirit would be seen not as strength, but as defiance to be crushed. So she knelt, she breathed, and she endured, letting their hatred wash over her like a foul tide. She had survived the loss of her home, the death of her family. She would survive this. Then the atmosphere in the hall shifted. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A sudden drop in pressure, as if a storm front had rolled in without warning. The whispers died instantly, choked off into absolute silence. The very air grew thick, heavy with a presence that demanded submission. A primal scent flooded the space, eclipsing the cloying perfumes in sterile stone. It was the smell of a winter forest after a lightning strike, ozone, wet earth, and ancient pine. It was the scent of absolute, untamed power. Two massive doors at the side of the hall swung open without a sound. King Corvin Alther entered, and the world seemed to shrink around him. He was not just a king, he was a force of nature, taller than any wolf she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his entire kingdom. His hair was the color of midnight, unbound and falling past his shoulders, streaked with a startling slash of silver at one temple. He wore no crown, no ostentatious finery, only simple black leathers that did nothing to hide the formidable muscle beneath. A long, jagged scar cut down from his left eyebrow, bisecting his lip and disappearing into the dark stubble along his jaw. It gave his face a brutal, intimidating cast, but it was his eyes that held the true terror. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with a feral light that seemed barely contained. They were the eyes of a wolf who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. The court bowed as one, a ripple of movement like grass bending before a gale. Only Miriam remained as she was, kneeling, her head still lowered. She could feel his gaze sweep across the hall, a physical weight that made her skin prickle. She heard the soft, deliberate tread of his boots on the marble as he ascended the dais and settled onto his throne. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Every breath in the room was held captive. Vareth, the king's voice was a low growl, a rumble of stone grinding against stone. It vibrated through the floor, up through Miriam's bones. "You requested my presence." "Your Majesty," the chamberlain said, his earlier smugness replaced by a fawning deference. "The tribute from the Solthar pack, as we discussed." King Corvin said nothing for a long moment. Miriam could feel his eyes on her, and it was a different kind of scrutiny from the court's. Theirs was contemptuous, dismissive. His was something else. It was invasive, peeling back the layers of her composure, searching for the thing she kept hidden deep inside. The dormant, silent wolf within her stirred for the first time in years, a faint, trembling flicker of awareness in the face of this overwhelming alpha presence. It was terrifying. "Leave us," the king commanded. The order was so quiet, yet it cracked through the hall like a whip. A collective, nervous shuffle rippled through the courtiers. Lady Iskara shot a venomous glare toward Miriam, her lips thinning in displeasure, before turning and sweeping from the room with the others. Vareth hesitated for a second, a protest forming on his lips, but one look from the king sent him scurrying away. The great doors boomed shut, leaving Miriam alone on the vast marble floor with the scarred king on his throne. The silence that descended was profound, a living thing. Now, without the distraction of the court, his scent was overwhelming. It filled her lungs, a wild, clean fragrance that was both intoxicating and dangerous. It spoke of dominance, of sorrow, and a rage that was banked like embers, ready to ignite. He was the embodiment of everything her pack had lost to. She kept her eyes fixed on the crack in the stone. To look at him would be a challenge, an invitation. She was an object, a tribute. Objects did not meet the eyes of their masters. "You are Miriam Solthar," he stated. It was not a question. She gave the barest of nods, her throat too tight to speak. Even if it weren't, her voice was a rusted, broken thing, a casualty of the trauma that had silenced her wolf. "They say your line is weak, that you have no wolf to speak of." His voice was devoid of emotion, a flat, assessing tone. She flinched. It was the deepest shame of an Omega. To be wolfless was to be incomplete, a hollow shell. Her wolf wasn't gone, merely buried under layers of grief and pain, sleeping a sleep so deep it felt like death. But he could not know that. No one could. "Look at me." The command was soft, but it held the unyielding power of a true alpha. It was not a request to be considered, but an order to be obeyed. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her pride, the last tattered remnant of who she once was, fought against the compulsion, but the primal part of her, the Omega instinct she so despised, could not resist. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her head. Her breath caught in her chest. Up close, the intensity of his gaze was a physical blow. Those molten gold eyes were not just angry or cruel. They were ancient, filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. She saw the ghost of a great loss lingering in their depths, a pain that mirrored her own. For a split second, she forgot to be afraid. She forgot her place. She simply saw a male whose soul was as scarred as his face. And in that moment, he saw her too. She knew it. He saw past the dirt, the drab tunic, the bowed head. He saw the flicker of defiance she tried so hard to hide. He rose from his throne in a single, fluid motion. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and deliberate, descending the steps of the dais. He did not stop until he stood directly before her, his massive form eclipsing the light from the windows, casting her in his shadow. He towered over her, a mountain of contained violence. She had to crane her neck to even see his face, and her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She expected him to dismiss her, to have her thrown out or sent to the servants' quarters to be forgotten. She expected a cruel touch or a final, humiliating word. Instead, he knelt. He lowered himself onto one knee, bringing his scarred face level with hers. The scent of him was dizzying, a storm she was trapped in. His golden eyes bored into hers, and the world fell away. There was no hall, no throne, only the crushing intensity of his focus. His gaze dropped for a moment to her lips, then back to her eyes. "They told me you were broken," he murmured, his voice a low, rough rasp that sent a shiver racing down her spine. His hand came up, slow and deliberate, and he cupped her jaw. His thumb was rough with calluses, but his touch was shockingly gentle. It was the first gentle touch she had felt in a year. They were wrong. His touch was a brand. The warmth from his calloused thumb seeped into her skin, a shocking jolt of life against the frozen landscape of her existence. For a year, she had been untouchable, a ghost in her own life, passed from conqueror to captor. Now this king, this fearsome alpha who smelled of storm and sorrow, was looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. His words, a low rumble that vibrated in her chest, echoed in the silent hall. They were wrong. Miriam's heart stuttered, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Fear warred with a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Validation. He saw. He looked past the Omega designation, past the conquered status, past the dirt and the silence, and he saw. The dormant wolf within her, so long a cold and silent weight, stirred again. It was not a conscious thought, but a deep, primal instinct. A shivering awareness that recognized the alpha before her, not as a captor, but as something more. A potential, a danger, a mate. The thought was so terrifying, so blasphemous, she shoved it back down into the darkness where it slept. King Corvin's golden eyes held hers, searching, demanding. He saw the flicker of her inner wolf, she was certain of it. A faint narrowing of his gaze, a subtle shift in his scent, told her he had perceived the change in her. He held her jaw for a moment longer, his thumb stroking once over the sharp line of her bone, a gesture of assessment, not comfort. Then slowly, as if reluctant, he withdrew his hand. The absence of his touch left her skin feeling cold and strangely empty. He rose to his full, intimidating height, but he did not return to his throne. He stood before her, a dark monolith, his shadow still enveloping her. The Soltar pack was known for its seers, its truth speakers, he said, his voice low and contemplative, not for its warriors. Yet your alpha met my vanguard on the field. He knew it was a hopeless fight. Why? The question was a blade, sliding between her ribs to pierce the heart of her grief. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second. The image of her alpha, a kind, gentle leader, standing bloody and defiant before a wall of snarling Althir warriors, flashing behind her lids. He had died to give the pack's children time to escape into the deep woods. He had died for honor. How could she explain that to this king of conquerors? With what voice? She opened her eyes and met his gaze directly. She could not speak, but she was not helpless. She lifted one trembling hand and pointed to her own heart. Then she flattened her palm and held it steady in the air, a universal sign for loyalty, for steadfastness, for his pack, her gesture said. For us. A muscle feathered in Corvin's scarred jaw. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but a new light had entered his eyes. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. Honor, he breathed, the word a soft puff of air. He seemed to taste it, as if it were a foreign concept in his gilded court. He looked away from her then, his gaze sweeping over the empty hall, lingering on the polished banners and cold stone. A rare commodity in this place. His grief, which she had scented on him before, rolled off him in a palpable wave. It was a cold, bitter fragrance beneath the power and pine, the scent of a wound that had never healed. The betrayal he suffered, the death of his first mate, the whispers about it had followed her all the way from her ruined home. They said he had turned to stone after her death, his heart a frozen thing. Looking at him now, seeing the profound desolation in his eyes, Miriam believed it. He was a king haunted by ghosts, ruling over a court of snakes. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the great doors, shattering the fragile intimacy of the moment. Your Majesty, Vareth's voice called out, laced with a sycophantic urgency. Lady Iskara presents a matter concerning the border patrols. It requires your immediate attention. Corvin's entire demeanor shifted. The introspective, grieving male vanished, and the formidable Alpha King returned in a surge of raw power. A low growl vibrated in his chest, a sound that was felt more than heard, and the very air in the hall seemed to crackle with his displeasure. The scent of ozone intensified. I did not give you leave to approach, Corvin snarled, his voice carrying effortlessly to the door. There was a beat of terrified silence from the other side. Apologies, Your Majesty, but Lady Iskara insisted. Does Lady Iskara rule this kingdom? The question was soft, lethal. No, Your Majesty. Then get out of my sight, both of you. The next person who disturbs me without my express command will be explaining their insolence to my dungeon master. The sound of footsteps retreating in haste was the only reply. Corvin turned his golden gaze back to Miriam. The fury was still simmering just beneath his skin, making him seem even larger, more dangerous. He looked at her, kneeling on the cold floor, a pawn in a game she hadn't asked to join, an interruption he refused to tolerate. She braced herself, certain this was the end. His patience was spent. He would dismiss her now, send her to the kitchens or the kennels, forgotten. Rise, he commanded. The order was sharp, absolute. Miriam hesitated, her muscles locked by years of ingrained Omega deference. Omegas knelt, especially before the Alpha King. I will not repeat myself. The steel in his tone finally broke through her paralysis. Awkwardly, her limbs stiff and cold. She pushed herself up, her knees aching from the long ordeal on the marble. She stood before him, her head still bowed, her thin tunic offering no protection from the chill of the hall or the heat of his gaze. She felt fragile, exposed, a sapling before an ancient oak. He circled her slowly, like a wolf assessing a new member of its pack. She stayed perfectly still, her breathing shallow, every nerve ending screaming. She could feel his eyes on her back, tracing the line of her spine, the shape of her shoulders. He stopped behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her own traitorous skin prickled with awareness. They see you as a plaything, he murmured, his voice a low vibration just beside her ear, sending a tremor through her. A momentary distraction. They are fools. He moved to stand in front of her again, his presence a wall she could not escape. A king cannot afford to be surrounded by fools, or vipers. He was speaking of Vareth, of Iskara. He knew. Her earlier perception was right. His grief had blinded him, but he was not stupid. He was simply alone, a king on a throne of shadows and whispers. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not lust or even curiosity, but a stark, calculating decision being forged. He was a king who trusted no one, and in her silent, unbroken defiance, he had found something he couldn't quantify, something his court of sycophants utterly lacked: authenticity. He lifted his hand and beckoned to the side door through which he had entered. A royal guard, clad in silver and black, materialized from the shadows, as if summoned by thought alone. The guard's face was impassive, but his eyes darted to Miriam with a flicker of surprise before becoming carefully blank. This is Miriam Soltarkots, the king said, his voice ringing with command. She is no longer a tribute. She is under my protection. You will escort her to the West Wing. Settle her in the Luna's chambers. The guard's jaw went slack. For a heartbeat, pure shock shattered his disciplined expression. The Luna's chambers. They had been sealed for 5 years, ever since the death of Corvin's first mate. They were a shrine, a memorial, a place of sorrow no one dared to even whisper about. To place a conquered Omega, a tribute, in that sacred space was not just a statement. It was a sacrilege. It was a declaration of war on the court's every expectation. Miriam felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to cry out, to protest, to refuse. This was too much, too fast. He was not protecting her. He was putting a crown of fire on her head. He was making her the center of a storm. She shook her head in a small, frantic motion, her eyes pleading with him. No, please. Corvin's expression was unyielding. She will be given fresh clothing, food, and she will not be disturbed by anyone. Is that understood? Yes, Your Majesty, the guard stammered, recovering himself and bowing low. Go, Corvin ordered, his gaze still locked on Miriam's. His eyes held a silent, grim message. This is done. Endure it. Numbly, she allowed the guard to lead her away. He kept a respectful distance, his posture stiff with shock and a newfound deference. As they passed through a set of ornate antechamber doors, she saw them. The court had not dispersed. They had been waiting, gathered in small, whispering cliques. Vareth stood beside a furious-looking Lady Ascara, their heads bent together. As Miran passed, every whisper died. 100 pairs of eyes turned to her, no longer filled with simple contempt, but with a new, sharper emotion. Disbelief, quickly curdling into venomous hatred. They saw the royal guard escorting her, saw the direction they were headed, toward the hallowed forbidden West Wing. Miriam's eyes met Lady Ascara's across the suddenly silent room. The highborn Alpha's beautiful face was a mask of pure, murderous fury. Her icy eyes promised pain. They promised retribution. The king had not given Miriam a sanctuary. He had given her a more beautiful cage. And he had handed the key to a pack of ravenous wolves. The Luna's chambers were a place frozen in time. The guard opened the heavy, dark wood doors and stepped aside, his face a carefully blank mask that did nothing to hide the awe and trepidation in his eyes. He would not cross the threshold. Miriam did, taking a hesitant step onto a thick Aubusson rug. Its deep crimson and gold patterns muffled her footsteps. The doors clicked shut behind her, the sound unnervingly final, sealing her inside the heart of the palace's most painful memory. The air itself was different here. It was still and cool, heavy with the scent of what had been. Not dust or neglect, the rooms were immaculate, but the ghost of a presence. Dried lavender and cedar lay in silver bowls, their fragrance having long ago steeped into the velvet curtains and the polished wood of the furniture. And beneath it all, faint and ethereal, was the scent of another she-wolf. A happy one. It clung to the silk of the bed linens, the carved handle of a silver-backed brush on the vanity, the very air she was now forced to breathe. It was the scent of Corvin's dead mate. Miriam felt like a grave robber. Her breath hitched, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the sudden, piercing cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This wasn't a sanctuary, it was a mausoleum. Every object was a testament to a life she had not lived, a love she had not known, a position she had not earned. She was a weed planted in a hallowed garden, and she could feel the ghost of the former Luna, watching her with silent, accusing eyes. A massive four-poster bed, draped in shimmering silver silk, dominated one wall. Across from it, French doors stood open to a stone balcony that overlooked the palace's moon garden, its white and silver blossoms glowing faintly in the twilight. Miriam drifted toward the balcony, drawn by the sliver of open sky. The air outside was fresh and clean, scented with night-blooming jasmine, a welcome reprieve from the preserved memories within. She rested her hands on the cold stone balustrade and looked down. Far below, courtiers moved like insects, their bright silks flashing in the last of the light. She could feel their eyes, even from this distance, turning upward to this window, to these forbidden chambers. She was a specimen in a glass jar, and they were all watching, waiting for her to shatter. A soft knock came from the door. Miriam flinched, spinning around. The door opened to admit 2 young she-wolves in servants' livery, their arms laden with folded linens and clothing. They kept their eyes downcast, their movements stiff with a mixture of fear and reverence for the room they were in. Behind them came an older she-wolf, her back ramrod straight, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot. Her scent was of lye soap and starch, and her expression was pinched with disapproval. "I am Marin, head of the household staff," the older woman said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "His Majesty has ordered a bath be drawn for you, and that you be provided with suitable attire." She gestured to the clothes the younger servants carried. They were simple gowns of soft wool and linen in muted colors, gray, cream, and deep blue. They were a world away from the rags Miriam wore, but they were also a far cry from the vibrant silks Lady Ascara and the other court ladies favored. She was being elevated, but only so far. Miriam gave a small nod of assent, her throat too tight to even attempt a sound. Marin's sharp eyes raked over her, missing nothing, the dirt under her nails, the gauntness of her cheeks, the defiant tilt of her chin. The disapproval in her gaze deepened. "The bath is through there," she said, pointing to an adjoining door. We will lay out the garments for you." The bath was a sunken marble pool, already steaming with scented water. Miriam sank into the heat, the water a blessed relief on her chilled skin and aching muscles. She scrubbed away the grime of her long journey, the filth of the cell, the residue of the great hall's polished floor. But as the water turned gray, she knew she could not wash away what she had become, a symbol, a provocation, King Corvin's weapon against his own court. As she stepped out and wrapped herself in a thick, soft towel, she felt more exposed than ever. She chose a simple gown of deep forest green. It fit as if made for her, the soft wool clinging to her slender frame. The transformation was startling. Staring at her reflection in the silver-framed mirror, above the vanity, she saw not the conquered Omega, but a stranger. Her pale skin, now clean, seemed almost luminous against the dark fabric. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, looked huge and haunted in her thin face. The silver brush of the dead Luna lay beside her hand. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, and pulled it through the tangles of her long, dark hair, until it fell in a smooth curtain down her back. She was a doll, being dressed for a performance she didn't understand. When she stepped back into the main chamber, it was empty, the servants gone. But she was not alone. King Corvin stood by the open balcony doors, staring out into the night. He had entered as silently as a shadow, his presence filling the room, eclipsing the ghostly scent of his former mate with his own powerful fragrance of storm and pine. He turned as she approached, and his molten gold eyes swept over her. He took in the clean skin, the neat hair, the simple but elegant gown. A flicker of something, approval, possession, perhaps something darker, passed through his gaze. "Better," he said, his voice a low rumble. Miriam stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting in the folds of her dress. She was acutely aware of the bed behind her, of the intimacy of the space. They were alone, in his dead mate's rooms. The impropriety of it was a suffocating weight. "This place," she began, her voice a fractured, rusty whisper, the first sound she had made in his presence. It was painful, like using a muscle that had atrophied. His gaze sharpened, honing in on her as if she had shouted. "Is now yours, Duokata," he finished, his tone leaving no room for argument. She shook her head, a violent, negative motion. "No, I cannot. It is a shrine, her shrine." "Her name was Lyra," he said, and the name fell into the room like a stone into a still pool. The grief that rolled off him was a physical force, so potent and raw, it made Miriam's own sorrow ache in sympathy. "And she is gone. A shrine is a place for the dead. I am a king of the living." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "And you, Miriam Solthar, are very much alive. More alive than anyone else in this palace of ghosts." His proximity was overwhelming. Her senses were flooded with him, the dormant wolf inside her uncurled, stretching its limbs, drawn to the sheer, unadulterated power of the alpha before her. It was an instinct she couldn't control, a magnetic pull that was both terrifying and thrilling. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet room. "Why?" she whispered, the single word scraping her throat raw. "Why me?" "Because you do not lie," he answered, his voice dropping lower, becoming rougher. "Your eyes speak the truth even when your mouth will not. Because you have known loss, and you have not broken. Because my enemies look at you and see a toy, and their blindness will be their undoing." He lifted a hand, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would touch her again. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him. "Come, the performance is not over." He led her from the chambers, back through the silent corridors of the West Wing. Guards snapped to attention as they passed, their eyes wide with shock. They emerged into the main artery of the palace, and the whispers started immediately, a sibilant tide that followed them. He ignored them all, his long strides purposeful, his powerful form a shield that parted the sea of courtiers before them. He led her back to the one place she never wanted to see again. The great hall was filled, even more crowded than before. It seemed the entire court had been summoned. They stood in tense, silent clusters, their faces a mixture of confusion, outrage, and morbid curiosity. At the forefront stood Lady Iskara, her face a pale mask of fury, her ice-chip eyes burning into Miran. Beside her, Vareth the Chamberlain looked smug, as if certain this was all some elaborate prelude to Mirren's final public humiliation. Corvin did not pause. He strode directly to the dais and ascended the steps, pulling Mirren along with him. Her hand was cold in his warm, firm grasp. He did not take his throne. Instead, he turned to face the assembly, positioning Mirren beside him, a step below. She stood exposed, the focus of every hateful stare. "You have whispered," Corvin's voice boomed, silencing the hall instantly. "You have plotted. You have circled my throne like vultures, waiting for a moment of weakness. You look upon this Omega, a tribute from a conquered pack, and you see a weakness, a trifle, an amusement." He let the words hang in the air, his golden gaze sweeping over them, making them shrink back. "You are wrong." He released her hand and turned to a small iron-bound chest resting beside the throne, a chest Mirren hadn't noticed before. He lifted the heavy lid. When he turned back, he held a circlet of woven silver. It was crafted to look like two wolves, their bodies forming the band, their heads meeting at the front, holding a single teardrop moonstone between them. It was elegant, powerful, and achingly familiar from the royal portraits. It was the Luna's crown. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Iskara's face contorted in a silent scream of pure hatred. Corvin turned to Mirren. His eyes were blazing, holding her captive. He saw her terror, her silent plea. He ignored it. This was not for her. This was for them. This was his move, his checkmate. "They called you a plaything to be broken," he said, his voice lowering to a growl that was still audible in the dead silence. "A tribute to be used and discarded." He lifted the crown. The moonstone caught the torchlight, glowing with a soft, ethereal fire. But the alpha of this pack decides who is worthy. The king decides who is valued. And with the eyes of the entire world upon them, he lowered the silver crown and settled it onto Mirren's head. The metal was heavy, cold against her hair. The weight was immense, a physical burden that made her want to sag, to collapse. It was not a prize. It was a target. It was a sentence. He stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers. She stood there, frozen, the conquered Omega, with the Luna's crown on her head, the symbol of everything they despised and coveted. King Corvin Alther turned his burning gaze back to his stunned, furious court. His hand came up, not to touch her, but to hover just behind her shoulder, a gesture of undeniable possession. "You will not whisper about my weakness," he roared, his voice cracking like a thunderclap. "You will kneel before my strength. You are not to address her as tribute. You are to address your Luna." His gaze found Iskara's in the crowd and held it, a promise of violence in his eyes. He then looked back at Mirren, his voice dropping to a possessive feral growl that carried to every corner of the hall, sealing her fate. "She is not your concern. She is mine." The crown was a cage of ice and silver. Its weight was a physical manifestation of the hundreds of hateful stares boring into Mirren from the floor of the great hall. Each whispered gasp, each flicker of rage in a courtier's eyes, was another bar in the prison Corvin had just built around her. The moonstone at her brow felt as cold as a shard of winter, leaching the warmth from her skin. She wanted to rip it from her head, to throw it at the king's feet, and scream that she wanted no part of this savage game. But her limbs were frozen, locked in place by the sheer, audacious finality of his declaration. "Your Luna." The silence that followed his words was absolute, a dead, suffocating vacuum. It was the silence of utter shock, of a world tilted violently off its axis. Then slowly, like the creak of a glacier, the court began to move. It started with the guards, their training overriding their disbelief. They thumped their spears against the marble and dropped to one knee. Then the lower-ranking pack members followed, their movements jerky and uncertain. Finally, with visible, agonizing reluctance, the highborns sank into a bow. All except one. Lady Iskara remained standing, a pillar of crimson silk and incandescent fury. Her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides, her beautiful face a mask of such venomous hatred that Mirren felt a physical chill. For a tense, drawn-out moment, it seemed she would defy the king's order outright, that she would shatter the fragile peace with a challenge. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, her icy eyes locked on the crown atop Mirren's head, as if she could melt it with the force of her rage. Corvin did not speak. He did not need to. He simply shifted his weight, a a subtle, predatory movement, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. It was the sound of a landslide starting, of a storm about to break. The primal, absolute authority in that sound finally broke Iskara's defiance. With a barely perceptible tremor of rage, she inclined her head in the most shallow, insulting bow imaginable. Before turning on her heel and sweeping from the hall, her attendants scurrying in her wake like frightened mice. The spell was broken. Corvin gave a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "Leave us." The court practically scrambled over itself to obey, melting away into the antechambers and corridors, their hushed, frantic whispers, a buzzing tide of scandal and outrage. Mirren was left alone on the dais with the king, the heavy silence of the great hall rushing back in to fill the space. The torches hissed in their sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that made the snarling wolf heads carved into the throne seem to move. Miriam's entire body began to tremble, a delayed reaction to the terror and shock. Her knees felt weak, threatening to buckle under the impossible weight of what had just happened. She finally found the strength to lift her hands, her fingers fumbling at the cold metal of the crown. "No," Corvin's voice was sharp, stopping her. "It stays." She looked at him, her gray eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. She could not speak, but her expression screamed the words for her. "You don't know what you've done. You've signed my death warrant." "I know exactly what I have done," he said, his voice lowering, answering her unspoken cry. He stepped closer, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that left her breathless. "I have painted a target, but the target is not on your back. It is on theirs." He reached out, not to touch her, but to tap a single calloused finger against the moonstone at her brow. The brief contact was an electric jolt. "This crown is a light, and it will draw the vipers from their shadowed corners. They will not come for you. They will come for this, for the power it represents. And when they show themselves, I will be waiting." He was using her. She was bait. A beautiful silver-crowned lure cast into a pool of sharks. The realization was a cold, hard stone in her gut. This wasn't about protection, not really. It was a calculated, ruthless political move. And she was the pawn. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through her fear. It was an unfamiliar emotion, one she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She took a half-step back, pulling away from his proximity, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she did not lower her eyes in submission. She held his gaze and let him see the flash of fury, the silent accusation. She saw a flicker of surprise in his molten eyes, quickly replaced by something that looked unnervingly like respect. "You have a fire in you, little wolf," he murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred lips. "Good, you will need it." He turned and strode down the steps of the dais. "Come, the night is not over." He led her not to her new, gilded cage in the West Wing, but through a series of private, guarded corridors deep into the heart of the palace, to his own personal study. It was a stark, masculine room, a world away from the opulent chambers he had given her. The walls were lined with shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound books and rolled maps. A massive fireplace, large enough to roast a boar, dominated one wall, a low fire crackling in its hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, old parchment, and the lingering, powerful scent of the king himself. A massive desk of dark, polished wood stood before the fire, littered with documents and a half-empty decanter of amber liquid. This was his lair, the true seat of his power. He gestured to one of two high-backed leather chairs before the fire, and after a moment's hesitation, she sank into it. The leather was worn and soft, still holding the faint warmth of the flames. Corvin poured a small amount of the amber liquid into 2 glasses, handing one to her. She looked at it, the scent of strong spirits rising from the glass. "Brandy," he said, settling into the chair opposite her. "Drink it, you look like you're about to shatter." She took a small, tentative sip. The liquid was fire in her throat, but it sent a welcome wave of warmth through her trembling limbs. Corvin watched her over the rim of his own glass, his eyes hooded, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. The scar on his face was thrown into sharp relief, a jagged line of shadow. "Lady Iskara," he said, his voice a low growl. "Her father, Lord Sorathan, controls the northern pass. It is the only trade route that remains open during the winter. He has used that leverage for years to press his daughter's suit. He took a slow drink of his brandy, his eyes never leaving her face. He was giving her information. He was arming her. Vareth the Chamberlain, he continued, is ambitious. He controls the palace administration, the flow of coin, the whispers in the servants' halls. He believes he is the true power behind the throne. He sees me as a grieving brute, easily manipulated. Miran listened, her mind racing. He was confirming what her own instincts had told her. The court was not just hostile. It was a tangled web of allegiances and ambitions, and she was now at its very center. They believe you are my weakness, Corvin said, swirling the liquid in his glass. They will test you. They will try to humiliate you, to prove to me and to the pack that you are unworthy of that crown. They will lay traps of etiquette and protocol. They will try to isolate you. His gaze was so intense, she felt as if he were trying to pour his own strength, his own will to survive, directly into her. Do not let them, he commanded. You are not a Solthar Omega anymore. You are the Alther Luna. Your silence, which you wear as a shield, can be a weapon. Observe, listen. They will underestimate you. They will speak freely in your presence, thinking you are nothing more than a deaf-mute decoration, and you will bring what you learn to me. He was making her his spy, his partner. The thought was as terrifying as it was intoxicating. The dormant wolf within her, which had been stirring fitfully, now sat up, its ears pricked. This was not the passive existence of an Omega. This was a hunt. A sharp, clear bell chimed somewhere in the palace, signaling the midnight hour. Corvin drained his glass and set it down with a decisive click. There will be a formal dinner tomorrow evening, to present you to the pack's inner circle. Vareth will arrange it. He will ensure it is an ordeal for you. Iskara and her allies will be there. They will be watching for any sign of weakness. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the feral glow in his eyes. Show them none. The command hung between them, a challenge and a threat. Before Miriam could even process it, he rose, his audience with her clearly at an end. He summoned a guard with a silent gesture. Escort the Luna back to her chambers. The title still sounded alien, a costume she was wearing. The guard led her back through the now silent palace. The weight of the crown seemed to have grown heavier, pressing down with the knowledge of the role she was now expected to play. When she finally returned to the silent, ghost-scented rooms, she found a tray of food had been left for her: roasted chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and fruit. She realized she hadn't eaten all day, and she was ravenous. She sat by the open balcony doors, the cool night air on her face, and ate mechanically, her mind replaying every word the king had said. Observe, listen, show them no weakness. Later, as she lay in the massive, unfamiliar bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin, she could not sleep. The crown sat on the vanity across the room, its moonstone catching the moonlight from the balcony, glowing like a watchful eye. It was a promise of power, and a beacon for every enemy the king possessed. She was no longer just Miriam Soltar, the broken Omega. She was a piece in the king's game, a queen on his board. And as she finally drifted into a restless sleep, she felt the first faint stirrings of her wolf, not as a source of fear or shame, but as a flicker of something she had thought long dead, the will to fight. The dining hall was a battlefield disguised by silk and silver. A long, polished mahogany table gleamed under the light of a dozen crystal chandeliers, each reflecting the flames of 100 beeswax candles. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the cloying perfumes of the high-born she-wolves seated around the table. Miran sat to King Corvin's right, the Luna's traditional seat, and felt the chill of the crown on her brow, like a brand of impending doom. Vareth had, as Corvin predicted, orchestrated the evening as a trial by fire. He had seated her directly across from Lady Iskara, whose gown of emerald green was a startling, venomous slash of color against the room's dark wood. Iskara's smile was a thin, bloodless line, and her icy eyes had not left Miran since she'd entered the room. To Iskara's right sat her father, Lord Sorathan, a heavy-set, formidable alpha, whose scent was of cold stone and ambition. He regarded Miran with a look of open contempt, as if she were an insect that had crawled onto his plate. The other guests, a curated selection of the court's most influential and skeptical alphas and betas, followed his lead, their conversation a low, pointed buzz that excluded her entirely. Corvin was a silent, brooding presence beside her. He ate little, his attention fixed on the room, his golden eyes missing nothing. He offered her no support, no words of encouragement. His message had been clear: show them no weakness. This was her test, and she had to face it alone. Servants moved like ghosts, filling goblets and replacing plates. A rich, fragrant stew was served. Miriam picked up her spoon, her hand steady despite the violent trembling in her core. She remembered her training as a highborn Omega in her own pack. The endless lessons on etiquette, the proper way to hold a fork, to sip from a goblet, to engage in polite, meaningless conversation. She had railed against those lessons as a girl, craving the freedom of a warrior. Now she clung to them as a shield. "It is a pity," Lady Iskara's voice cut through the low murmur of conversation, sharp and clear. All other talk ceased. "That the Solthar Pack's customs were so rustic. They must not have instructed their Omegas in the proper use of Althir silver." All eyes snapped to Moran's hand. She froze, the spoon halfway to her lips. She looked down. Vareth, with exquisite cruelty, had arranged her place setting with a complex array of utensils. Fish forks, dessert spoons, snail tongs, many of which were unique to the Althir court and entirely unfamiliar to an outsider. Iskara's implication was clear. She was a savage, an uncultured provincial who did not belong. A flush of hot, humiliating shame washed over her. This was the trap. A small, petty, but public test of her worthiness. They expected her to falter, to look confused, to prove their assumptions correct. She could feel Vareth's smug satisfaction and Iskara's predatory glee. She looked at Corvin. His face was a mask of stone, but she saw the flicker of fire in his eyes. He would not intervene. He was waiting, show them none. Her dormant wolf, the one she had suppressed for so long, stirred with a snarl. It was tired of cowering. It was tired of shame. Miriam took a slow, deliberate breath. She lowered the spoon back to her plate with a soft click. Then, with a grace she didn't know she possessed, she reached out and picked up her heavy silver goblet of wine. She held it aloft, the candlelight glinting on the polished surface. She did not look at Iskara. Instead, she met the gaze of Lord Sorathan. His eyes widened slightly in surprise at her directness. She swirled the deep red wine in the cup, her expression serene, thoughtful. Then she dipped the tip of one finger into the wine, raised it, and drew a single wet line down the back of her other hand, a blood-red mark against her pale skin. It was an ancient, nearly forgotten Omega ritual, a truth oath, a symbol that what was about to be communicated was absolute, sacred truth. The room fell into a dead, profound silence. Even Corvin stilled beside her, his attention utterly fixed on her. This was not in any etiquette book. This was something older, deeper. Still holding Lord Sorathan's gaze, Miriam slowly, deliberately picked up the utensil meant for snails, a delicate, two-pronged fork, utterly unsuited for the thick stew before her. She dipped it into the bowl, securing a single small piece of carrot. She brought it to her lips and ate it, her movements unhurried, almost regal. She then set the fork down, folded her hands in her lap, and met Iskara's stunned gaze with a calm, level stare. She had not spoken a word, but her message was as clear as a shout. "You give me the wrong tools for the task, and I will still find a way to nourish myself. You set a foolish trap, and I will not spring it. I will honor it with the truth of what it is, an empty gesture, and I will not be shamed." The sheer, unexpected audacity of the act stole the breath from the room. She had not only sidestepped Iskara's petty trap, but had turned it back on her, exposing the challenge as childish and dishonorable. Lord Sorathan's eyes, which had been filled with contempt, now held a flicker of grudging respect. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Vareth's smug expression had dissolved into one of baffled fury. And Iskara's face was a study in pure, unadulterated rage. Her carefully constructed social gambit had been dismantled by a silent Omega with a gesture from a forgotten age. She had been outmaneuvered, and she knew it. A low sound rumbled from beside Miriam. She turned to see Corvin looking at her, and for the first time, the stone mask of the king was gone. In his golden eyes, there was a blaze of something fierce and hot. It was not just approval, it was pride. A raw, possessive pride that sent a shiver racing down her spine. The corner of his scarred mouth lifted in a ghost of a true smile. A devastatingly handsome expression that made her heart skip a beat. His scent subtly changed. the ever-present notes of pine and storm now mingled with something warmer, muskier. It was the scent of an alpha pleased with his mate's show of strength. The realization hit Miriam with the force of a physical blow, and a confusing, dizzying warmth spread through her. The rest of the dinner passed in a tense, simmering silence. No one dared to challenge her again. She ate her stew with the correct spoon, her movements fluid and confident. Her appetite suddenly returned. When the meal was finally over, Corvin rose. "Walk with me," he commanded, his voice a low growl meant only for her. He led her not back to her chambers, but out onto the battlements of the palace. The night was cold and clear, the sky a sweep of diamond dust stars. A sharp wind whipped her hair back from her face and tore at her skirts, but it was a clean, bracing cold that felt wonderful after the stuffy, poisoned atmosphere of the dining hall. The kingdom spread out below them, a patchwork of dark forests and sleeping villages, the moonlight silvering the winding path of a river. They stood in silence for a long time, side by side, looking out at the vast, silent land. The power of it, the sheer scale of Corvin's domain, was humbling. "I have not seen an Omega Truth oath since I was a boy," he said finally, his voice deep and thoughtful. "My mother used to perform it when my father's counselors would lie to him." Miriam looked up at his profile, silhouetted against the starry sky. The wind ruffled his dark hair. The scar was a pale line in the moonlight. "You have a warrior's spirit, Miran Solthar," he continued, turning to face her. "Trapped in the body of an Omega. It must be a difficult existence." His perception was so acute it was unnerving. He saw her, not just the surface, not just the Luna he had crowned, but the struggling, conflicted girl she had always been. The Omega who had dreamed of wielding a sword instead of a tapestry needle. "You shamed her tonight," he said, his golden eyes glowing in the dark. "And you earned her father's respect. That is a dangerous combination. Sorathan values strength above all else. He will see you now not as an obstacle, but perhaps as a potential ally against his own daughter's weakness." "And Iskara?" she whispered. The name a puff of condensation in the cold air. "Iskara will never forgive you," he stated, his voice grim. "She will not try to shame you with words again. Her next move will be more direct, more dangerous. You must be on your guard." He took a step closer, and the wind whipped his scent around her. Pine and winter and that new, warmer musk. It was intoxicating. "You did well tonight. You showed them the steel beneath the silence." He lifted his hand, and this time he did not hesitate. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers grazing her skin. The touch was electric, a lightning strike that shot straight to her core. Her breath hitched. The dormant wolf within her rose up, not with a snarl, but with a deep, yearning purr, recognizing the touch of its alpha. It was a primal, undeniable response, a bond clicking into place that had nothing to do with crowns or politics. His eyes darkened, the gold deepening to a molten bronze. His gaze dropped to her lips. The space between them crackled with a tension that was suddenly no longer political or strategic, but deeply, dangerously personal. He leaned in, his head dipping, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to kiss her. She swayed toward him, her eyes fluttering shut, her entire being screaming for a contact she hadn't known she craved. His lips were inches from hers when a sharp, urgent cry echoed up from the courtyard below. "Your Majesty, an urgent message from the southern garrison. The border has been breached." Corvin froze, pulling back as if struck. The spell was shattered. The king returned in a flash of cold fury and command. He looked down at her one last time, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of frustration, possession, and a raw, burning hunger that left her shaken to her very soul. "We are not finished," he growled, the promise hanging in the air between them. Then he turned and was gone, his long strides carrying him away into the darkness of the palace, leaving Miriam alone on the cold battlements, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that had never happened, and her heart hammering with the terrifying certainty that the war for the crown had just become inextricably tangled with a war for her own heart. The ghost of his kiss was a fire she could not extinguish. For 2 days, Miriam moved through her gilded cage in a daze, the memory of that moment on the battlements replaying itself behind her eyes. The cold wind, the scent of him, the raw hunger in his gaze. It had unlocked something inside her, a longing so fierce and profound it frightened her. The dormant wolf was no longer dormant. It was awake, pacing the confines of her soul, its golden eyes identical to the king's, crying out for its mate. Corvin was gone. He had ridden out with his personal guard at dawn, the morning after the dinner, a whirlwind of black leather and grim purpose, headed for the troubled southern border. The palace, without his overwhelming presence, felt both larger and emptier. The oppressive weight of his authority was lifted, but so was the strange, terrifying sense of security she had begun to feel in his shadow. Now the whispers had teeth again. The hostile stares of the court felt sharper, more dangerous. They watched her every move, waiting for her to falter without the king to prop her up. Lady Iskara was a constant, simmering threat. She did not approach Miriam, but her presence was a poison in the air. Miriam would see her across a courtyard, her head bent with her father's, their expressions grim. She would catch Iskara's icy glare in a crowded corridor, a silent promise of retribution that made her skin crawl. Iskara was not a viper waiting to strike. She was a wolf circling its prey, patient and lethal. Miriam spent her days exploring the vast, lonely palace. She used the silence that had once been her shame as Corvin had instructed. As a weapon, she moved through the halls and gardens unnoticed, a gray shadow in her simple gowns. And she listened. She heard the guards gossiping about troop movements. She heard the kitchen staff complaining about Lord Sorathin hoarding grain shipments from the north. She heard the ladies-in-waiting whispering about Iskara's frequent secret meetings with a brooding, ambitious pack alpha named Darion, whose lands bordered the king's personal territory. Each tidbit of information was a stone she collected, a piece of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. This was the hunt Corvin had given her, and she found a grim satisfaction in it. It gave her a purpose beyond merely surviving. On the third day after the king's departure, Marin, the stern head of household, approached her. Her expression, usually pinched with disapproval, was softened by a flicker of concern. "My Lady Luna," she said, the title still awkward on her tongue. "There is to be a moon-blessing ceremony for the new pups in the lower village this evening. The Luna has always presided." Miriam's heart sank. A public ceremony, surrounded by the pack, without Corvin. It was another test, another potential disaster. But to refuse would be a sign of weakness, an admission that she was nothing without the king. She gave a firm, decisive nod. The ceremony was held in a clearing just outside the village, centered around a flat, ancient stone that hummed with generations of pack magic. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from the villagers' hearths. They gathered in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and hope. These were not the perfumed courtiers of the palace. These were the heart of the pack. Hunters, farmers, weavers, their hands calloused and their gazes direct. They saw not a political symbol, but a potential mother, a source of the pack's lifeblood. An older she-wolf, the pack's elder, greeted her. Her name was Olian, and her eyes were a milky, clouded blue, but her gaze was sharp and missed nothing. She gestured to a half-dozen mothers holding tightly swaddled infants. "The blessing of the Luna ensures their strength and ties them to the heart of the pack, my lady," Olian explained, her voice a reedy whisper. Miriam's hands felt cold and clammy. This was a sacred duty, performed by a true bonded Luna, one whose own wolf was strong and whose womb was fertile. She was a fraud, a barren, wolfless omega playing a part. The whispers of the court echoed in her mind. "They say the Solthar line is barren." She took a deep breath, pushing the fear down. She knelt before the first mother, a young woman with nervous, hopeful eyes. The mother held out her pup, a tiny, sleeping thing wrapped in soft fur. Miriam reached out with trembling hands. The ritual required the Luna to place her hands on the infant and channel a small spark of her own life force, her wolf's energy into the child, a blessing of vitality. But what could she give? She had nothing. Her wolf was a sleeping ghost. She placed her hands on the warm, swaddled bundle. She closed her eyes and desperately reached inward, seeking that spark, that flicker of her inner wolf. She found nothing but a cold, silent void. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was going to fail. Here, in front of the entire pack. She would be exposed as the hollow shell they all believed her to be. Then, She remembered the battlements, the feel of Corvin's hand on her skin, the scent of him, the raw, possessive heat in his gaze. She remembered the awakening she had felt, the deep, primal purr of her wolf responding to its alpha. He was not here, but the connection, the bond he had forged with his audacious claim was. Instead of trying to force a spark from her own empty well, she reached for that bond. She focused on the echo of his presence, the phantom touch on her skin, the memory of his power, and something answered. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a golden light that was not her own. It felt of pine and winter storms, of ancient strength and fierce protectiveness. It was his power, a thread of the alpha's energy, that was now inextricably tied to her. It flowed down her arms and out through her fingertips, a gentle, vibrant pulse that sank into the sleeping infant. The pup stirred, its tiny mouth curving into a contented smile. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The young mother's eyes widened, her face breaking into a radiant smile of pure joy and relief. Mirayan moved to the next child, and the next, her confidence growing with each one. She was no longer a hollow vessel, she was a conduit. She was channeling the heart of the alpha, the very spirit of the pack, into its future. When she blessed the final pup, the villagers erupted into a chorus of relieved, joyful howls, a sound of acceptance, of belonging that washed over her and healed a part of her soul. She had thought long dead. As she stood to leave, Olien, the blind elder, took her hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her clouded eyes seemed to look right through Mirayan. "The king's spirit is strong in you, child," the old wolf whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You are more than he knows." Mirayan returned to the palace as dawn was breaking, her heart lighter than it had been in years. But her relief was short-lived. As she entered the silent halls, she saw them. Verith stood in the main foyer, flanked by 2 palace guards. But there was someone else with them, Lady Iskara, and she was not alone. Behind her stood Darion, the ambitious alpha from the Western Territories, and a half-dozen of his largest, most brutal-looking warriors. They were not dressed for court. They were dressed for battle, their leather armor scuffed, and their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. "There you are," Verith said, his voice dripping with false concern that did not hide the triumphant glint in his eye. "We were so worried. Out all night, unchaperoned. It is not fitting for the Luna. What is the meaning of this?" Mirayan's voice was a harsh whisper, but it held a new note of authority she had found in the village clearing. Iskara stepped forward, a cruel, victorious smile gracing her lips. "The meaning, little Omega, is that the games are over." She gestured to Darion. "Lord Darion brings grave news, a tragedy." Darion stepped forward, his expression a mask of feigned sorrow. "The king is dead," he announced, his voice booming in the stone hall. "His party was ambushed in the southern mountains, a rogue attack. There were no survivors." The world tilted. The air rushed from Mirayan's lungs. No, the bond, the thread of warmth she had felt so strongly just hours before, it was still there, a steady, pulsing presence in her chest. He wasn't dead. He couldn't be. This was a lie, a power play, a coup. "You lie," she breathed, the words escaping before she could stop them. Iskara laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Ever the defiant stray. It matters not what you believe. With the king gone, the pack requires a new alpha. The council has been convened. Lord Darion has the strongest claim, and he has done me the honor of asking me to be his Luna." This was their plan: remove Corvin, install a puppet, and Iskara would finally have the throne she craved. Verith would be his chamberlain, his power solidified. "As the acting regent until the official challenge is complete," Verith said, stepping forward, his face hardening into a mask of cruel authority. "It is my duty to ensure the stability of the palace. The Luna's crown must be secured. And you, as a tribute of a conquered pack with no official standing, are a security risk." He gestured to the guards. "Seize her. Take her to the cells." The guards advanced, their faces grim. Mirayan backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind raced. The cells, to be thrown back into that darkness, helpless, while they stole Corvin's throne. No, her wolf, now fully awake and snarling, would not allow it. She held up a hand, a gesture of command that made the guards pause. You cannot, she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. The king placed me under his protection. The crown is mine by his decree. Iskara sneered. Your king is dead. His decrees died with him. She nodded to the guards. Now! They lunged. Miran dodged, her instincts screaming. She was an Omega. She had no hope of fighting them. But she would not be taken. She spun and fled, running deeper into the palace. Her only thought to escape, to find a place to hide, to think. She ran toward the one place she knew they wouldn't expect. Not her chambers, not the kitchens. She raced up a winding staircase, her breath tearing at her lungs, and burst into the king's study, his lair. She slammed the heavy oak door and threw the iron bolt. It wouldn't hold them for long. She leaned against the door, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of terror and fury. The scent of him was everywhere in the room. A phantom embrace. The bond in her chest flared. A desperate, pulsing reassurance. He's alive! He's alive! Heavy, splintering blows began to rain down on the door. They were trying to break it down. She was trapped. Her frantic gaze swept the room. The maps, the books, the cold fireplace. Her eyes landed on his desk. On a heavy, ornate letter opener, its blade long and sharp as a dagger. Beside it, a silver horn, intricately carved, used for summoning the palace's elite guard. Guards loyal only to the king himself. But who would they obey now? The door groaned, a long crack appearing in the wood. It would not hold. She had a choice. Cower and be captured, or fight. The Omega she had been would have wept. The Luna she was becoming, the Luna would act. With a cry that was half sob, half snarl, she grabbed the silver horn. She ran to the massive window that overlooked the central courtyard, threw open the shutters, and raised the horn to her lips. She drew a deep, ragged breath. The door behind her splintered, bursting inward. Just as Iskara and Darian's warriors poured into the room, Mirian blew. A single clear, piercing note cut through the morning air, an ancient call to arms, a desperate gamble, a challenge, an Alpha's call sounded by an Omega, for a king they all believed was dead. And as the warriors charged toward her, she snatched the letter opener from the desk. Its sharp point a silver promise of defiance. She would not be a plaything. She would not be a pawn. She would be the queen he had crowned, or she would die on his throne. 2 years later, the great hall of Silverwood no longer felt like a tomb. Sunlight, clear and bright, streamed through the high-arched windows, illuminating the rich tapestries that now adorned the stone walls. They depicted not scenes of conquest and bloodshed, but of harvest, of pups playing in moonlit clearings, of 2 great wolves, one black as midnight, one silver as the moon, running side by side through a thriving forest. The air, once heavy with fear and decay, now smelled of beeswax, fresh herbs, and the contented warmth of a strong, healthy pack. Mirian stood on the dais, not below it, but beside a second throne that had been carved for her. It was fashioned from the pale, luminous wood of a silver tree, a perfect counterpart to Corvin's dark, formidable ironwood seat. She wore a gown the color of a twilight sky, and the Luna's crown rested easily on her head, its moonstone seeming to glow with an inner light that was all her own. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, a silent, powerful promise of the pack's future. Below, the court was transformed. The vipers had been rooted out. Varth was a bitter memory, exiled to the harshest northern outpost. Iskara and her treacherous father had been stripped of their titles and lands, their influence broken forever. In their place stood a new inner circle, loyal, honorable alphas and betas who valued strength of character over bloodlines and ambition. Olien, the blind elder, now sat in a place of honor, her wisdom a guiding light for them all. Mirian's gaze found Corvin, who was speaking with his new chamberlain, a steady, level-headed beta from the southern territories. The scar on his face was no longer a mark of brutality, but a part of the man she loved, a testament to the battles he had survived. He looked up, his molten gold eyes finding hers across the room, and the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. The bond between them was a living, breathing thing, a constant, silent conversation that flowed with an intensity that still stole her breath. He had returned that day like a storm of righteous fury. Lured into a trap, yes, but not defeated. He and his elite guard had fought their way out of the ambush Darian had arranged, their numbers halved but their spirits unbroken. He had heard her call on the horn, a desperate, impossible sound that had lent wings to his feet and had arrived in the courtyard just as Darion's warriors cornered her in his study. The battle that followed was short, brutal, and decisive. Corvin's rage was a terrifying, beautiful thing to behold. He had moved through the traitors not as a king, but as a primal force, an alpha defending his mate. When it was over, Darion lay broken at his feet, and Corvin had crossed the blood-soaked study, not to the throne he had reclaimed, but to her. He had taken the dagger-sharp letter opener from her trembling hand, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive pride that eclipsed everything else. He hadn't spoken a word. He had simply pulled her into his arms, and, in front of the loyal guards and the cowering traitors, he had finally kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a brand, a claim, a feral declaration of ownership that had sealed their bond in blood and fire forever. Now he crossed the hall, his presence still commanding absolute silence and respect wherever he went. He came to stand beside her throne, his large, warm hand covering hers where it rested on their unborn child. "Are you tired?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. She shook her head, a soft smile touching her lips. "I am home." Her voice, once a rusted, broken thing, was now clear and steady. It was not loud, but when she spoke, the entire court listened. She was no longer the silent Omega. She was Mirren Alther, the Luna who had saved the throne, the queen who had healed the pack with her quiet strength and fierce heart. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, they stood on the balcony of their chambers, the rooms no longer a shrine to a ghost, but a home filled with their own life, their own scent. Corvin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched the first stars appear. "They called you a plaything," he murmured against her hair, his voice filled with a lingering wonder. "A tribute to be broken." "And what do you call me now?" she whispered, leaning back into the solid warmth of him. He was silent for a long moment, his arms tightening around her, holding her and their child in a circle of absolute safety. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back, a rhythm that had become the anchor of her world. "I call you my dawn," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed to anyone else. "You were the light that broke through the longest night of my life." He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes burning with a love that was as fierce and untamed as his wolf. "I call you my queen. I call you my mate. I call you my everything." He lowered his head and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the promises of a lifetime. The crown was no longer a target or a cage. It was simply a part of her, a symbol of the strength she had found not in a title, but within herself. The Omega who was meant to be a toy had become a queen, and the haunted king who sought only a distraction had found his entire world. Together they ruled, not just from two thrones of wood and stone, but from the unshakable foundation of a bond forged in whispers and sealed in fire, and their kingdom was finally at peace.